So I don't think those institutional stories will be news to anyone in this room, but this is a film that I really hope will reach audiences who have very little or no experience of disability. So I think it's really important that we tell those stories as much as they might be quite difficult to watch. I'd like to welcome up onto the stage now our first guests, Sue Smith from Saru, Colin Hiscoe from Reinforce, and Pauline Williams from Amida. These three guests are going to talk through some of the early days of deinstitutionalisation with me. But while they're coming up onto the stage, I just want to give you a bit of information, a bit of background. For much of Australia's history, there was actually no national program of disability service provision. This changed with the election of the Whitlam government, which passed the Handicap Program Assistance Act in 1974. Funding non-government organisations to provide housing to care for disabled people. Then in 1983, the Hawke government instituted a review of programs developed under this Act, and for the first time the review involved people with disabilities and their families as part of an extensive consultation process. The report resulted in the replacement of the Handicapped Persons Assistance Act of 1974 with the Disability Services Act of 1986. But before that, I'm going to talk about what some of the processes were around institutions. So I'm going to go and move over and have a chat with our guests. And hopefully, is there a mic? Oh no, you've got the mics. I've got mine's here. Forgot to take it with me. So Sue Smith from Saru, I want to talk to you first about the Senate report that happened in 1969, which really, for the first time, described what life was like in institutions and really put the spotlight on institutions, didn't it?
Yes, look, how I found it was really strange, really. I was working on an exhibition with people who had lived in an institution called Hidden Lives, and that exhibition also, because what I want to acknowledge, that was so powerful, Sarah, but the resilience of the people that live there also needs to be acknowledged. They created their own culture and their own world despite everything, and that's what the Hidden Lives exhibition wanted to record and tell. And I know when I was telling some of the stories, because I worked for many, many years supporting self-advocacy and advocacy within an institution, that the other people working on the projects, like when you hear things like that, oh, she's got to be exaggerating, not in this world did that happen. So I went as part of the project to this old dusty building, and really it was, which was the Victorian Archives, and I stumbled on boxes, fresh boxes of stuff that had just come off the notice boards and out of the drawers and everything when Sunbury was closed, and put into boxes. And in it was a typewriter Senate report of Labor senators who'd visit Sunbury. And it was just there that what they saw, basically they said, was beyond belief. You know, they went to M8, the locked unit, which was a horrendous unit at Sunbury, and saw people herded naked in the cold, you know, down to the showers. In some of the locked units in M8, there'd be just groups of men with one pot in the middle of the floor. And so this would be the earliest thing I've seen of government going and looking, and something that, you know, I could show to others and go, no, actually, this isn't exaggerating, or this isn't things that have been made bigger over years. Here it is from that 1969, which is relatively recent when you're thinking about it.
Well, it's in our lifetime. We're all getting a little bit older. And you actually ran a service that was located inside one of the institutions, which seems a bit counterintuitive now, but it sort of worked, didn't it?
It did. Look, along with Jackie, who's here, and Jan Coles, we set up Speak Up, a self-advocacy rights centre in the grounds. And at the time, I think, within advocacy and that, it was always, I think we were viewed with a bit of suspicion because you should be doing things out in the broader community and not doing things within the institution. And were we validating that institution? Were we making that institution look good? Because they could go, well, we've got self-advocacy. But basically, you know, I came into that world at 22 and very much similar sentiments of like, I had no idea this world existed. And I knew that if we could do the theoretically right thing by doing it outside, but no one's ever going to get to us. it would have looked good on paper. But so we set it up and eventually set up self-advocacy groups in every unit. And you'll see some of the old deinstitutionalised protests. We helped fill in those days they had to write leave of absence, get permission to leave, even though it must be said that the vast majority of people in there were voluntary patients, had the right to leave at any time, but that didn't matter. If they did leave, the police would bring them back. And so we went out with people who came out of the institutions to go and stand on the steps of Parliament House, to go to Sunbury and demonstrate to close institutions.
So people came out of the institutions to go and protest against the closure of them,
yeah,
which
to close it, against them. And so this is my opportunity to acknowledge that bravery, to live in an institution and go out and pick up protest signs outside of... I can't even begin to tell you how brave that is, and I don't think it's really been... it's not a commonly known part of the deinstitutionalisation movement of the 80s.
And what about, I remember hearing some stories about people who were determined to leave, Doug Pentland and Terry. The story of Terry, something about stealing the key and locking someone.
And if you go down to the board on deinstitutionalisation, there's a photo of Terry today holding the key. So he was in that horrendous, notorious M8, the locked unit, and he'd got out before, and he goes, I made the mistake, he's a great yarner, I wish he was here today, but he's not well. I made the mistake of going down to Melbourne, I think, got a job selling papers, and one of the staff saw him and he was taken back by the police. So he was in the laundry room, they had to do laundry stuff, and he heard the staff there, and he looked at the door that goes outside of the locked unit, and the key was in it, and he thought, this is my chance. So he went out and locked the staff member in. And I can remember when he told me that, I went, that is the best story I've ever heard. You locked the staff member in the locked unit? Yep. And he goes, I knew not to go to Melbourne, so I went west. So he went and took off and hid in some paddocks, and then hitched a ride with a truckie. And then the rest of his story, how he finally got to Melbourne, is another whole book in itself. But he became a really active campaigner in very many early, quite radical and activist groups around closure of institutions. And then just recently, he's got this amazing storage unit that Pauline just helped clean out, which is a testament to the 80s, and he found the key.
Oh, fantastic.
And so there's a photo up there of him holding the key, which I recommend you looking at.
Wonderful.
But, he was, I think, the driving force, and Colin will speak about that, to the deinstitutionalisation movement in Victoria, was people coming out at that time and just not settling for the fact that their friends and their families, that they were their families. It was their culture was still there.
What Anne MacDonald used to always say was free the still imprisoned. That was, so she got out, and then she never forgot the people that were behind. In the interests of sticking to the schedule, I'd like to introduce Colin Hiscoe, who you were involved, instrumental really in the establishment of Reinforce in the early 1980s, weren't you, Colin?
I wasn't one of the people that established Reinforce. I came 2 years later.
Right, yes.
In 1982. I'd heard about a conference that was happening at Summers with the lady that I was with, and we decided to go, and I liked what I was hearing, and I liked the stories that people were telling, and their stories were my story. My story was their stories. It was almost exactly the same. And so we were just deciding that we wanted to try to get together as a group, and to join forces, and to try to create break down the barriers that were existing within institutions.
And to get people out as well?
Oh, most definitely to get people out, particularly to get people out. Like Sue was just saying before about Terry, and another good two friends of mine, Doug Pentland and David Banfield and Des McIntosh. The Doug was a pioneer in those early days, and supported me a lot, and helped me to know what I'm doing and where I'm going, and all about Reinforce and what they're trying to do, and that was to try and close the institutions, break down the barriers, and to get people out. And that's why we went and we held a demonstration at Sunbury, at the Sunbury railway station. There was one at the steps of Parliament House. I believe there was one at Janefield, Sue was telling me before. That's probably when I disappeared and went to South Australia for 10 years.
Right, so you disappeared and then came back.
I disappeared and came back. I came back because of my mother. My mother was very ill, and I wanted to try and look after her and try to support her like she supported me in my life.
So when you were out demonstrating, how were those demonstrations received? How did people respond?
What are you doing here? Get out, you don't know what you're talking about.
So there was no understanding.
One thing that really gets me angry is that the people may work there, but they don't know how we feel. They don't know what we're feeling. It's like that video just before, and congratulations, by the way, on that video. It brought back some bad memories for me, but because I've been in one. But you're right, those things do need to be shown. I hope I'm around, and I hope I can come when you do it. It's finally finished.
It won't be long, I promise. I promise everyone.
So, all we want is the chance to be able to prove ourselves. All we want is that chance to be able to show that we can do something. How in the hell do you know we can't do something unless we try? Yes, we'll make a mistake, or we may make mistakes, or we may burn ourselves or whatever. But that's one way of learning. That's one way of showing that we can do it. For God's sake, there are still some institutions there now. Let's all try and band together and get the rest of these institutions closed completely. I beg on everyone in this room to try and join together as one big force.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Now, Pauline, you were involved in Amida.
Yes.
Did you establish Amida? Or
No. Amida's probably about 35 years
Please tell us
old.
about Amida.
But I have been there a long while now.
I know you.
I got involved in this issue because at the time that I began working at Amida, so we'd had the sort of closure of Cooloola in the 80s and St Nicholas, and things seemed to be moving in the right direction, and then we got a Liberal government in 92.
Can I just add for the audience, there was also the Office of the Public Advocate was established in the 80s as well, and that was important. That was an important piece, wasn't it?
Well, I know that community visitors, and Chris Borthwick has said this, publicly, so I'm not getting him in trouble, leaked the community visitors report on Cooloola to advocacy groups so that what they saw could get out publicly and sort of shame the government into closing Cooloola, which eventually did happen fairly quickly after that. But in the 90s, what happened was that we got a Conservative government who wanted to build a new institution, and it would be a really great, new facility, they said. So they took the wrong attitude. They didn't think, as the human right is, that everyone has a right to live in the community and have inclusion. Instead, they said, oh no, the problem with the institutions we've got is they're not modernised. We need a modern institution.
It sounds creepy to me.
So in the process, they were closing Kingsbury and Janefield and building a new institution. So 100 people are still living out at Plenty Residential Service, as it's called, or when it was being built, we were calling it the New Janefield, and so we had this ridiculous situation. And Colin is right. People tell you that they're the experts and that you don't have the experience and you don't understand that these people need an institution. So we challenged that, and advocacy groups did everything from have demonstrations, play the game and go to the consultative committees, but also take them to court. And using anti-discrimination legislation, we challenged that view that you were actually trying to meet people's needs by building a new institution, and we won that, essentially. But the government said, well, okay, then everybody can go on the list for housing outside of the institution. And of course, as we all know, when you're on the list, if you're already accommodated, you don't move to the top of the list.
You just stay on the list forever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are a few people, and I'd particularly like to mention Walter Collier, who has since died, who lived in Janefield, also lived in Kingsbury, and was eventually moved to the new institution they built. And he continued to fight the whole time for his chance. That's what he kept saying, I just want a chance to live in the community. Unfortunately, he was never allowed that chance by the government. He tried to meet with the minister wouldn't meet with him. But he continued to fight for that right, as did a lot of other people. There were many people who'd lived in Sunbury and other institutions who went down and demonstrated. Katie Ball had herself on a tripod suspended in the air for about
It's in
24
Defiant
hours.
Lives. We found the
Yes.
footage. We found the footage.
Yeah.
No one's seen it for a long time, but it's there. You'll see it in the film.
And I think, like, the good legacy, if I can just say that, is that now with the NDIS, the new guidelines are such that they won't fund anything where there are more than 10 people on one site anymore.
Even 10's too many.
Even 10's too many, but that's not in one building. So 5 is the limit for a building under the new NDIS funding guidelines, which is still too big for a lot of people. But out at Plenty Residential, there are 100 people congregated on one site. They'll never build that again, and now all we have to do is close it down. So we've got to keep doing that.
You told me about the government not giving the money to these institutions in the whole of
In the future, that's right.
and making sure that they all close down.
Yes, so the other thing about that funding is it's saying that the legacy, they're calling them the legacy properties that the NDIS has inherited, which is the institutions, all have to close within 5 years. Well, they won't be
Yes.
funded anymore, so...
Yeah, and that's what we all want, and have, you've all been struggling for many years. So maybe in 5 years there should be a really big bottle of champagne opened
That's
and a
right,
big party
hope
the day the last one closes. Colin, I believe you are going to introduce the next song for us. We're going to move on to the next phase of the discussion. Yes, absolutely.
Just before we do, can I say one thing? And that is that congratulations, and yes, the United Nations Rights of People with Disabilities, fantastic. It is here. But we're still not getting our basic human rights in some areas, and we still need to keep on fighting. The institutions are still built. The right to get married, the right to have a family, the right to live with whoever you wish to live with, whether you're gay or lesbian or whatever, and that's still up in the air. So, yes, congratulations on the human rights, but we still have to keep on fighting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you all for your contributions, Sue, Pauline and Colin. And Colin, I believe you've got an introduction for the next song while we scamper off the stage for a moment.